I feel I haven't been talking about primitive accumulation for the last 30 years. But now what am I going to say in 15 minutes? So we're supposed to look at the future and results. What are the prospects? And I think in good spirit of history as a historian, although I'm not really an historian, I will look a bit at the past. And the first question that I'm going to ask is, how has the interest in primitive accumulation been generated? Because I feel that there's been something a bit missing, and perhaps it will help us to look ahead, also to rethink at the moment in which primitive accumulation becomes a key concept again in political organizing, which I date more or less around the early 80s in response to many different movements, actually even before, not the early 80s, but in the early 80s, it really expands. So I'm going to start very, very briefly, with the history of the concept of primitive accumulation in social movements. And I would say very briefly that certainly the first rethinking of Marx on primitive accumulation comes with the anti-colonial movement. Anti-colonial movement, of course, so including the movement against apartheid and racism in the United States. And I can make many names. One name that has come in my mind, just listening to some of the comments and the discussion, was that of Cedric Robinson, Black Marxism, that goes back and looks. But even before him, of course, Amir Amin and the Gunther Frank, etc. The feminist movement, and I'm going to go back to it, in the early 70s and late 70s. And again, of course, in the early 80s, the anti-globalization movement, which is responding to the restructuring of the world economy, which very soon, many, including some of us here, soon recognized was a process of recolonization and primitive accumulation. I want to mention here a journal that in which Peter and I were involved, called Midnight Notes. And Midnight Notes in 1990 came out with an issue entitled The New Enclosure. They looked at primitive accumulation in different parts of the world. I wrote a piece on Africa and primitive accumulation because I was coming back. I'd been in Africa for a few years, in Nigeria, and I saw primitive accumulation unfolding under my eyes with the arrival of the IMF, the debt crisis, the arrival of the officers, and, a coup, the military government, the declaration by this government of the war against indiscipline, etc. So also I want to mention, as part of those debates, which I think will be really interesting to look at this history, because I think there's something that we have learned. It's important to know that all this, the politicization of primitive accumulation, has also left something that I think is important not to ignore. I want to mention, for instance, the journal The Commoner UK, that has really carried out a huge debate on primitive accumulation, originary accumulation, primary accumulation for quite some times, and in England. So I would encourage you to look at that, because my next question is, what is that we have learned? What is that we have learned, and what are some of the key questions, of course, that remain? And I think there's a lot that we have learned that I would like to summarize in very simple terms, and then see if we agree and see where we go from there. First of all, primitive accumulation. What does it mean to think of primitive accumulation politically? I think that Peter said it very beautifully and poetically, as always. It means to confront the fact that, capitalism is a violent government, is a violent system, and that capitalism requires as a structural necessity, the continued displacement, the continued impoverishment, the continued expropriation, and of course that is implemented with tremendous amount of violence, massacres, mass incarceration, enslavement. That these moments that we associate with primitive accumulation are not anomalies. They are not anomalies, and but they are really part of the system, structural part of the system. I think that when we take primitive accumulation as a political concept, the first thing that we have to confront that, because if that is the case, there are then political consequences. Then there are political consequences for our organizing and for our vision of what is the future and what do we do on a day-to-day basis and what kind of, end goals we put on our banners. So, yes, capitalism as a system then that is not sustainable. As a system that is not sustainable. And in fact, here I want to say something about the temporality, because there was an alternative that was posed. It's primitive accumulation, where we have learned that it's not just at the beginning, that it continues, it's then permanent. I think it's important to see that those are not the only two alternatives, right? That there's a third alternative that I think is very important. Primitive accumulation comes into capitalism. Capitalism is always violent, but those primitive accumulation marks those moments of which Marx speaks, those moments in which large masses of people are thrown into the labor market. And it's a response by capitalism to moments of crisis. It really is the capitalist response to the necessity to give new foundation, to restart the system. In other words, it's a response to a crisis. It's a response to a political crisis of profit, crisis of value creation, crisis of capacity to discipline labor, to command the labor process, and so forth, right? So that's very, very important to see that, which of course raises the question, right? Raises the question, which I think has not really come up, which is, why now, right? Why now, we have this return of primitive accumulation? What have been? And I think here there's a big discussion. I mean, I'm just going to throw a few things, but obviously the discussion is much larger, because to me it's very clear that on one level, the return of primitive accumulation in our time, it's a direct response to the whole cycle of struggles that took place, that culminated in the 60s, anti-colonial, student, women, and, anti-imperialist, etc., which by 1994, created so much crisis in capitalism that, if you remember, at least those who have my age, in Rome there was the Club of Rome called for zero growth. They were the first to call for zero growth in 1994, because they didn't see any hopes for profits. Right? And then, of course, began the major restructuring, so that the whole world had to be changed, so that everything, in a sense, could remain the same. The capacity for exploitation could be reactivated, and we know that's the story of the restructuring of the global economy. There's also, of course, a theory, and, my own partner is very fond of it, that, capitalism is entering some sort of secular stagnation, because all the effort that it's making to escape the struggles are pushing it to invest into technologies that are, eliminating, reducing its capacity to accumulate surplus value. But that's another story. And also, I think it should also raise question concerning if primitive accumulation is the accumulation of labor, then, shouldn't we be reconsider theory that say that labor is no longer needed by the capitalist class. That now they have all this machine and labor is not needed. If labor is not needed, why they are bothering to create such more intense form of exploitation? Why they are bothering throwing millions and millions again? So I'm throwing this question to say that we have to look at it politically in terms of understanding what is the political moment, which means what kind of forces we have, what kind of context we are really operating in order. We have to understand what is the problem in order to be able also to build not only resistance, but processes that are transforming our society in effect. Now, the next thing I want to say, what is also that we have learned that capitalism, the primitive accumulation is not only accumulation of workers and accumulation of assets or lands, but is also accumulation of differences. This is one point that I've made very, very strongly in Caliban, and in which the capitalism creates continuously. In other words, the transformation of economic relation, it's also a continuous transformation of inequalities that inherited by previous social system like feudalism, but that they are given a new form. They are given a new form. And so the processes of racialization and of course also the restructuring of gender relation and so on. So I want to say a few words here about the importance that war has given, and I'm not referring only to my work, but certainly the feminist theory, the feminist movement of the 70s. And I'm thinking here also of Maria Mies and Claudia von Verloof and many other, the contribution that they've given to a whole rethinking of Marxism and primitive accumulation in particular from the viewpoint of reproduction. And, which for us was a key, obviously for us, reproduction, expressed the specific form of exploitation of women in the society that we lived in. And it was obvious for us to look at the history of capitalism from that conception. I'm very happy that today social reproduction, it's a commonplace. But I have to say that when we began to assert that, Marx's understanding of the rise of capitalism has been very, very limited, and that the whole issue of social reproduction was outside of it, that it was a real serious battle, which really raises all kinds of questions about what have been the limits of the traditional left, and maybe not only traditional. So again, the other things that we have learned, that if it is the case that capitalism exploits workers not only in the production process but also in the process of reproduction, then it means, for us to look at primitive accumulation also from the point of view of the dispossession, not only of land, not only, of forestries and so forth, but also dispossession of bodies. So we began to realize that primitive accumulation also implies a whole new control on women's body. Dispossession of knowledges. And so this is, I think, these are all themes that need to be added to our, discussions of primitive accumulation. Okay, let's see where I'm going from here. Yes, the question of, so primitive accumulation has to be told from many points of view, many histories. There's not one history, many histories, they are connected. But it's all important because unless we see all these histories, and attached to each history, there's also social movements, we are not going to be able to understand what is the totality of capitalist accumulation. What are all the mechanisms that capitalism has been able to organize and continuously organize in order to be able to maintain its power, right? For example, today we are facing, if you're looking about the future, we are facing one of the major obstacles, right, to build not only resistance to the expansion of capitalist relations, but also create a new society. It's the way in which the racialization, the divisions along the line of race, along the line of gender, is continuously undermining the possibility, is continuously undermining the possibility we have to have a common ground. And I think that this is an issue that we need to confront. Moving ahead, to think about the future, what are the issues that we need to put on the table? I think that there are many issues, because what we have touched here, which was already a big tapestry, it's only a small part. For example, now, just from a feminist viewpoint, from the viewpoint of the struggle that women are making across the world, right? There's a lot of work that is being done, not only by historians. There's a lot of work that is being done by women in organization at the grassroots level. For example, trying to understand what is the relation between the new forms of capitalist accumulation and the new forms of primitive accumulation, and the surge of violence that has been taking place across the world, including a return of witch hunting. There are now witch hunts in Africa, India, now East Timor, several parts, and I'm afraid it's also beginning in Latin America. So, but not only witch hunts, but really the broader process of violence against women, how this connects. There's a very interesting literature in different parts of Latin America that is dealing with that. Also, we need to look at the question of debt. Right? Debt as an instrument of primitive accumulation, both sovereign debt, the debt that triggered the structural, that was triggered by structural adjustment, as well as individual debt. And here again, turns out that the main debtors often are women. In the United States, this is certainly the case. In fact, women who have gone and taken wage jobs are the ones that are usually carrying on the largest debt. I think also the question of knowledge. The primitive accumulation and what it has done to educational system and to traditional knowledges. The wiping out of the major effort that has been out to destroy memory and to destroy educational system. And so I think that this is a very, very important. For years I've been working in an organization called the Committee for Academic Freedom in Africa, where we studied the destruction of educational system in that continent and connecting it precisely with the new forms of division of labor triggered by the restructuring of the world economy. And it's very clear that destroying the ability of people, to produce knowledge, to communicate knowledge, and to keep their memory is very important. On the other hand, and here again, there's a lot of work that is being done, there's also an understanding that in those areas, rural or urban, where communities are most able to remember their history or to reconstruct their history, the capacity for opposing the attack that is coming today by so many in so many forms, agribusiness, mining, the whole politics of extractivism, even the commercial companies that come into areas, to plant, for green gasoline, to plant crops for green gasoline, so that the commons of the world have probably never been under so much attack. And, but there's a lot of work that women, for example, in Latin America are doing on the issue of memory, and they are beginning to connect memory, the ability to remember, what happened in their territory, right? The struggle they were there. And look at their territory, okay, as a living place, as a place that is dense of history. Also create a common interest, a collective process, a collective subject, creates an ability to resist that is not otherwise available. And one more minute, I want to close, continuing on what Peter has said. No, actually, I just published another book called Reenchanting the World. Half of that book is on primitive accumulation, and the other half is on resistance to primitive accumulation. And it's about the commons. The other half, not only resistance, but the other half looks at the struggle that people, mostly women, across the world are doing in Africa, Latin America, and other places are doing to create a society precisely in response to primitive accumulation, precisely in response to dispossession, expropriation, displacement. Because it's very often, it turns out that very often are the people who are on the outside, those who appear to be the outside of capitalism, right? Those who have no hope that there's going to be tomorrow a more democratic form of capitalism, a capitalism with a human face. That unfortunately many in the left still hope that capitalism can be humanized. But those who now, are carrying all the wounds of capitalism on their body and don't see any alternative, but through collective work, they are creating another world. And I think I agree with Peter that we cannot speak of primitive accumulation, which is a crucial political concept today, without also speaking about the resistance, and not only resistance, the fact that already, in fact, and this is my last word, I don't think you can resist without creating a different world. My experience of all the struggles that I've learned of in my 77 years of age is that there's never just resistance as pure opposition. In order to resist, you really have to transform the way you live. You have to create new relations. There's no resistance as the petition of what has been in the past. Resistance always implies creativity, a creation. This has always been true, even in the strike. The strike at Flint, Michigan, the 30s. Every major strike, for example, in the United States, when it reached the point that people knew they had to go for broke, those moments when you say, you put all your life at stake in a struggle, immediately their daily life changed. People began a whole network, a whole set of activities, common activities, putting together their resources, helping each other, because no way they would have been able to survive, knowing that the possibility of a future of another life, really resided in that capacity to come together and to confront whatever attacks they were under together. Thank you very much.